In this video, we'll take a look at migrating a phone from enterprise firmware registered to CUCM to MPP firmware, also known as 3PCC firmware for WebEx Calling. And we'll take a look at Wireshark captures during the process to see what types of transactions may be occurring. This video is intended if you're having issues with the firmware migration to give you some visibility and ideas on different things to look at. They might be interfering with the phone's successful firmware migration. Okay, we're going to go ahead and go to the WebEx Control Updates and Migrations. We're going to click on the MPP card. We're going to go ahead and start a new task for the firmware migration. And I'm going to give it an 8-character name, 8 characters or greater. That's going to be unique. So typically I end up using a combination of the letters and also numbers, perhaps a date or a number, if you will. Okay, that should be good. We'll hit next. Okay, we're going to upload the CSV file. I've already created the CSV file. Okay, so it shows one device. Each one of these steps is going to take about 15, 20, 30 seconds for the verification check to execute. The phone we're going to be migrating today is going to be at 8841. Okay, it shows it's eligible. And then this will be kind of the last check. And what we're waiting for is the in progress to turn green. Okay, so it just turned green, ready for migration. Okay, so what this means is the virtual firmware migration license is ready. We'll take a look at the phone here before we do the migration. Okay, so we can see it's enterprise firmware 12.7.1. It's a Cisco 8841 phone. It is registered to CUCM. So this is the phone right here. And we will go ahead and click on the device. Okay, let me go back to the cloud upgrader. And what we're going to do is, I'm not going to use bulk migration. I'm going to just do one phone. I'm at upgrade.cisco.com, enterprise to MPP for WebEx Calling. And then if we go down this page, notice there's a bulk migration, but I'm not going to do bulk migration. I'm just going to do one phone, and I'll show you in a moment how I'm going to do a single phone without using the bulk migration. So we're going to copy the load server URL, and I'm going to find this via the Control F option. Okay, so there's a load server field. We're going to paste that in. We're going to check box that. Okay, so let me go back. It did not take that. Okay. Okay, the next item is going to be the phone load, which would be the 14.1.1 enterprise firmware. And I'm going to do the same thing, phone load for Control F. Okay. And we're going to go, okay, looks like I already had this from past labs I've done. That's okay. So we're going to apply to config. We're going to hit OK. Okay, we're going to go and save it. Okay, we're going to go and reset it. Okay, we're going to take a look at the Wireshark capture during the firmware migration so we can actually see what is occurring. So I have this running a notebook that's plugged into the same switch as the phone. I'm doing a port mirror. The source port is the port, switch port where the phone's located. The destination port is where this notebook with Wireshark is located. So you're actually seeing the transactions and the transfer of information from the cloud to the phone. And the idea is to get some visibility if you're running into issues with the firmware migration workflow. This video hopefully will give you some insight of different things to consider if you're running into issues. DNS is a big part of this. There is a lot of information flying across the screen. We will take a look at some stuff towards the end. Okay, so the phone says it's ready to upgrade. Device will restart in, and then has a countdown timer, 8, 7, 6, and so forth. So what happens is the phone will initially ingest the firmware, and then once it's ingested all the firmware, at the very end, the phone will actually give you that message on the display with a countdown timer, 15 all the way down to 0, 1 seconds, if you will. Then it'll reboot. The reboot takes about a minute and a half. The firmware download process typically takes somewhere between 3, 4, 5 minutes, assuming that you don't have any type of bandwidth limitations. I'm doing one phone here, and there's really no type of bandwidth constraints where I'm doing this testing at. If you're going to be doing many phones, first you want to test with just 1 or 2 phones to make sure from start to finish that the workflow is going to succeed in your environment. And number 2, as you start doing more and more phones, you do not want to overcommit doing too many phones, just in case you run into any issues. You don't want to end up having to troubleshoot a lot of phones. So I recommend just doing a few phones initially, making sure it's consistent. Also time, how long does it take? Generally, when I've done this process, it's around 15 to 20 minutes from start to finish. But if you start doing larger batches of phone, let's say you start doing 10 phones, 15, 20 phones, most likely, unless you have a lot of bandwidth capacity, most likely you're going to see the window of time from start to finish for the phones to complete start stretching out. Half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, etc., etc. So you definitely want to not overcommit, but have a balance between how many versus how long it's taking, and also if there's any hiccups, you'll be able to troubleshoot everything. Okay, so once this finishes with the firmware upgrade, we're going to check to make sure that it's running enterprise firmware 14.1 (1). That's the minimum firmware that's needed before we can migrate it from enterprise to MPP firmware, also known as 3PCC firmware. Please be aware, when you're watching this video in the future, definitely look at the most current documentation, because most likely the versioning that you'll be working with may have changed versus what I'm showing right now. So always look at the upgrade.cisco.com site. We're going to take a look at the phone information right now, just to verify that it has 14. Yep, it's 14.1. They're showing it 14-1-1, but it's 14.1 (1). Okay, so now we're going to go to part 2 of our firmware migration workflow, which is going to be loading the MPP, or if you will, 3PCC firmware. So we're going to copy that right there, the firmware load name. And then we're going to go ahead and find the field within CUCM for that phone, and we're going to adjust the phone load name for the 11.3.7 MPP. And we're just going to check the load server just to make sure it's still there, that nothing has changed before we commit. Okay, so we look good. It's right there. Okay, we're going to apply the config. Hit OK. We're going to save it. Okay, we're going to reset, and we're going to close. Okay, so part 2, which would be now migrating from enterprise 14.1 (1) to MPP 11.3.7. So once the phone goes through this firmware migration, reboots, once the phone reboots, CUCM will not have visibility to the phone, because the phone will be on MPP firmware at that point of time. really you could not go back to CUCM and look at the phone because with the MPP firmware there was really no relationship with CUCM. But in any case, we're looking at the live capture of the packets, the transactions between a phone and a cloud and vice versa. And generally, as I mentioned, the firmware in downloading, ingesting is typically somewhere between 3, 4, 5 minutes, assuming there's no types of bandwidth limitations. And then once it finishes ingesting a firmware, the reboot is about 1.5 minutes. Okay, so we have our message ready to upgrade, and device will restart in 10, 9, 8, etc., etc. It's highly recommended physically for yourself or somebody to be on site. That one of the reasons is during certain phases of the firmware migration, you will really not have visibility of what's occurring with the phone or phones. And if anything hiccups, it's going to be very difficult to troubleshoot. So definitely either yourself or somebody needs to be on site where the phones are. So if we lose connectivity to the phone or the phone gets stuck, it needs to be rebooted, factory reset, or whatever the issue is. If something occurs, it's really critical for somebody to be on site. The other thing also I was going to mention is in my deployment, I only have DHCP option 150, which is the common DHCP option used for enterprise phones with CUCM. And the only other option I have is for DNS, which obviously pretty much you would use anytime you use DHCP, any type of DHCP clients, if you will, with a DHCP server. Be aware that if in your deployment you also have DHCP options 66 and 160, that can interfere with this process. So be aware of that. Okay, so stating configuration check is in progress. This will take a few minutes. Also be aware the date and time, it will be wrong that you'll see on the phone, and that is fine. When you're going through the firmware migration and then onboarding, there'll be certain phases of the process where the time shown on the phone's LCD screen will not be correct. It will get updated and you'll see the right information. So that's just part of the process. And what's going to happen is when a phone boots up with the 11.3.7 MPP firmware, it's going to do a handshake with WebEx Calling, and it's going to pull down a config. And as the recording of this video during this time period, there is a new firmware load available in the WebEx Cloud server, which is 11.3.7 SR1. So there'll be a moment of time, maybe 30 seconds, a minute or so, where it'll look like the phone is completed its firmware migration onboarding, but it really has not. So you may get some messages that may look concerning. So we just got a message there about a migration license. Please contact your administrator, but it went away. Again, this is all normal and part of the firmware migration process. Just give it a little bit of time to go through the motions and stabilize. Okay, so saying system booting. Okay, so we have our extension, we have our phone number, and okay, looks like this extension just went active. And I'm going to give it a few moments before I touch it because I'm not sure how quickly it is going to try to do anything. So we're going to take a look at the Wireshark here, because what it's going to do this phase is it's going to realize that there's newer firmware, and it's going to start downloading. As you notice, there's quite a bit of activity going on right now. So it's going to start downloading the 11.3.7 SR1 firmware. And then once it's service release 1, once it downloads the firmware, then we'll get another message, countdown message that there's new firmware and it's going to reboot. And again, when you're viewing this video, definitely look at the upgrade.cisco.com site for any new information regarding what firmwares are being used, and also the WebEx help documents for the firmware migrations, and also there's a white paper for migrating Cisco phones that has a lot of good information on it. Okay, so there we go. It's stating now firmware upgrade in progress. And then the reboot, as I mentioned, is about 1.5 minutes. One other thing I should mention is this phone is plugged via RJ45 physical cable. If you ever run into a situation where you're using like an 8865 phone which has a Wi-Fi capability, please be aware, definitely want to do the firmware migration with it hardwired. And the MAC address you're going to be using for the firmware migration, like the CSV file, to generate the virtual license via the firmware migration tool within WebEx Calling, will be the MAC address of the physical port on the phone, the RJ45 port. So that is critical. It may not come up often, but sometimes that may be a little confusing which MAC address to use and use the physical port. Okay, so the phone looks like it's back up. We're going to take a quick look at the status product information, okay? So if you notice at the bottom, 11-3-7, and the last 3 digits are 284, that equals the SR1. So this is the 11-3-7 SR1 firmware grade. If you notice the name of the product, CP8841-3PCC. So we look good on this right now. We're going to take a look at dial tone. Okay, we have dial tone. Excellent. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and take a look at, this is where the phone was upgrading the firmware from 12.x enterprise firmware to 14.1 using CUCM in conjunction with the Cloud Upgrader site instructions. So you notice as I was getting kind of things prepared in my environment, the phone was quite idle. There wasn't much occurring. And then once I actually gave the commands, as you notice, the load server URL and also the binary information, and I triggered the upgrade, that's when the phone started downloading this section right here. And if you notice, I did an IP address filter for the screen bump right here that shows the firmware download. And that was being sourced from 3.134.166.179. So if we take a look at the port usage document for WebEx Calling, or port reference document for WebEx Calling, you'll notice that IP address is listed right here in the chart. And this is basically part of the cloudupgrader.webex.com site. So again, if you have a secure environment where you do additional filtering, URL, ACLs, etc., you definitely want to take a look at this document to make sure something's not interfering. Assumption is DNS is functioning. Assumption is both CUCM and also the phone has reachability and can resolve DNS queries on internet. And then if we go back here and take a look at the, so this is within Wireshark, just kind of shows the host transactions. The phone was the 192.168.10.50. It received here 85 megabytes of information. And then the source that a majority of that information came from was a 3.134.166.179, a cloud upgrader. And then the other item I mentioned briefly that's very critical is going to be DNS. So if we come here and we type in DNS, you'll notice there's quite a lot of activity going on here from a DNS standpoint. So definitely, if things are not working, we want to make sure that the phone is able to resolve DNS, CUCM is able to resolve the DNS, because what's going to happen initially when you give the instructions for the Cloud Upgrader site to CUCM, it's going to try to resolve it and give that information over to the phone, and vice versa, especially the phone at later stages when it migrates over to the MPP firmware, it needs to be able to resolve. So both of those need to be able to resolve DNS. Here we're going to take a look at the conversations between the phone and the cloud. So we know the phone is at 192.168.10.50. And this is going to be the conversations that were recorded between a phone and a cloud during the firmware upgrade from 12.x to 14.1 So we'll notice it had communications with 3.20.185.219, and then it had a good amount of data transfer from 3.134.166.179, and that is approximately 83 megabytes. And then of course DNS 8.8.8.8, and then also some local transactions. Okay, we'll take a look at the second PCAP or Wireshark capture I took, and this is the phase where the phone is running 14.1 enterprise firmware. That kind of represents this green section here. So basically it's on the left hand side. At this point it's running the 14.1 enterprise firmware, and then it downloads the 11.3.7 MPP firmware. The phone reboots, it does a handshake with the cloud, and then it goes through the registration process for WebEx calling, and then it realizes the phone does that it gets instructions from WebEx Calling. There's newer firmware 11.3.7 service release 1 or SR1, and it downloads that. So that's kind of what we see as the two bumps here. So the first phase is going from enterprise to MPP. Then the phone is, reboots during this phase. It boots up in MPP firmware, does a handshake with WebEx Calling, pulls down a config, and then goes through the registration, and it realizes there is newer firmware waiting for it, downloads that, and reboots a second time and registers. The key things here we need to be aware of is if we go to the Cloud Upgrader site and we go into the Enterprise MPP, there's a network firewall section. We definitely want to make sure if you're running into any issues, does the DNS work for both CUCM and also the phones? Can both of them resolve? Basically, the phones are getting DHCP address from DHCP server. Are they pointing to a DNS server that can resolve that? Likewise, is the CUCM cluster pointing to a DNS server that can resolve that information? VoIP VLAN does have internet connectivity. And then in my example, I'm just using DHCP option 150 for the phones. Obviously, I also have information for DNS. So for DNS, I'm using 8.8.8.8, so 4 8s and dots in between, Google DNS. And then if we have restrictive firewall rules, we need to make sure that the following items are allowed. So basically, cloudupgrader.webex.com, ports 6970, 443, activate.cisco.com, ports 443, activation.webex.com, ports 443, asterisk or wildcard.wbx2.com, ports 443. And then the other item, if we take a look at here, that is offered within Wireshark. So here I'm showing the phone. So the phone actually just got two different firmware updates. One was a migration from enterprise to MPP, and then the second was from MPP 11.3.7, an upgrade to MPP 11.3.7 SR1, and received here 147 megabytes of data. And then the two devices in the cloud, the services in the cloud, if you will, that did a majority of this data transfer. The first one is 3.134.166.179. So it went ahead and transmitted about 70 megabytes, and then the other one was the 199.59.65.228, and it transmitted 68 megabytes. So that's the bulk of the actual information. If we go back to Wireshark, as I mentioned, DNS is very critical. So for example, one of the IP addresses I referenced is listed here, 3.134.166.179. So if you are running into issues, definitely take a look at those items. The other one is there's a specific page just for the port reference usage for WebEx calling. This is one of the other IP addresses that I mentioned from the Wireshark that was offering the firmware for the phone. and then you notice it's listed here. This page here is more focused on the WebEx Calling side, but it is part of the whole workflow of the migration, onboarding, and then the functionality of WebEx Calling with the 3 PCC phones. And this is fairly extensive. This document does get updated from time to time, so you definitely want to take a look at it if you're running into issues, or preemptively if you're getting prepared to do firmware migrations, to have a better understanding what's needed if you have a very strict networking configuration. And then this also talks about domains that need to be allowed for the phones to be able to reach out to the cloud. So there's quite a bit here. So we'll scroll down. And then the other thing, and then these are some of the document revision history. So this does get updated from time to time. This was updated just the other month. It lists here November 15 of 2022. I'm recording this beginning of 2023, but in any case, this does get updated from time to time, as you notice. Okay, here we're going to take a look at the conversations the phone had with the cloud when it was migrating from Enterprise 14.1 over to 11.3.7. So we'll see there's again DNS, and then of the conversations, the one with the largest amount of data transfer is going to be 3.134.166.179. It's listed at 72 megabytes. And then the other ones we have is we have 3.20.185.219. And we also have the rest of these. So I'm not going to really read off all of these, but you can stop the video, make a comparative analysis if you're running into issues with the firmware migration. So you notice all of these that have 192.168.10.50. These are the different cloud-based services or servers, if you will, that it was making connections with during the firmware migration / onboarding process. So there's quite a bit of items here. And then, of course, this is private address space here, the 192.168. So hopefully this gives you an insight to some of the things that are occurring during the firmware migration from enterprise firmware to MPP. So the phones were registered. In this case, the phone was registered to CUCM, and then it was migrated to WebEx Calling using a cloud upgrader as a resource. Hopefully this video has helped. Thank you for watching.